Hi everybody, how are you today? It's Mrs. Snook. Today we're going to be talking about really the clashes that take place between Native Americans and American settlers as they move west in the late 1800s during this whole period of westward expansion. This whole chapter so far, we've been all about manifest destiny, and it is this belief that, you know, God has determined that Americans should expand from sea to shining sea and people should move west. And so far, we've talked all about how people are moving west because that there's, gold rushes and there's silver rushes and all of this, you know, wealth has been discovered out west. And not a lot of people actually, really got rich from going out west and mining. It's really just those big companies. But there was still, the possibility of wealth. And we've also talked about how people went west, for a new life to escape racism if they were exodusters. We talked about how people are farmers, right? They're homesteaders, and under the Homestead Act, the government was going to give them 160 acres of land for free if they farmed it for 5 years. It was an opportunity to reinvent themselves, especially after the Civil War, after seeing such terrible atrocities and, going through this difficult period in their lives. However, we haven't really talked about how as people went west via the newly built Transcontinental Railroad, they were going to be taking over land that was already occupied by Native Americans. So what we're going to look at this week is we're going to be talking about how Native Americans, specifically the Indian tribes living in the Great Plains, are going to be decimated by all of these Americans who move west in search of a better life, and how the government continuously mistreats Native Americans, treats them inferior, disrespects them, believes that they are superior to aspects of their culture, and finds ways to really purposely change these people's way of life. So when we're talking about Native Americans, you need to think back to 8th grade into your elementary school years a little bit. And remember that when we're talking about Native Americans, we really don't like to refer to them as Indians. When we're talking about people who are Indians, that's people who are living in India. And often the idea of calling Native Americans Indians, that goes back to the days of Christopher Columbus. 1492, he sailed the ocean blue. He thought that he would find a quick way to travel from Spain and Portugal, and he could sail west to get to China and India to get spices rather quickly, obviously not knowing that the American continent existed. When he landed in the islands in the Caribbean, he thought that he was not too far from China, that he was somewhere west, or I should say east of it, and that eventually he would get to China and to the West Indies and to India, where he would collect spices and silks and things of that nature. It's only, of course, years later that the cartographer, the map maker, Amerigo Vespucci, realizes, hey, this is a whole nother continent. This continent does not, match up with what we know the structure of China is. And so this must be a whole other continent. And so Waldseemüller, who was a cartographer at the time, named the new continent after Amerigo Vespucci, who had first kind of done some discoveries there. So it's very important that we're talking about Native American tribes because these people are the ones who are native to America, who they lived there first, lived there for hundreds of years, thousands of years before Europeans ever showed up. And they are by no means Indians. That's yet again part of the, overwhelming superiority of white culture that we think they are better than them, or have just misused this term over the years, and perhaps don't think they're better still, but it's still a misuse of the term. And honestly, I do it myself sometimes as well, because that's just the nature of what we've been brought up in. Now, the other thing is when we're talking about different Native American tribes, to realize that they're going to all have very different ways of life. When we're talking about different tribes, they are impacted by geography and by where they live. And so the Plains Indians, are probably ones you're familiar with because they're the ones who are hunters, going from place to place on horseback. Many of them are nomads in search of water and food and, just a better life. And they are definitely territorial, trying to make sure that no one comes in and, claims the buffalo living in their area because they would need that as a food source. And they all kind of work together as the unit, even though the men are often the hunters and women, more have domestic jobs in terms of taking care of children and animals and a food source. ultimately, they work as a group, they are a team, they're all well respected, they travel together, and women have skills in terms of hunting and horses and things like that, just like anyone else. And they do have some, plants and things like that, and some small farms, but for the most part, we really think of them as more hunters and gatherers, compared to true farmers. Now, most of the Plains Indians, though, are the ones that you're thinking of as the true hunters. They're not really the farmers per se. Now, the most important thing to the Plains Indians really is the buffalo. One of the things that you need to understand about Native American peoples is that they believe that, their religious views are tied to the land and tied to the earth. And for the most part, they're not polytheistic the way that the ancient Egyptians or Greeks or Romans were. They're not going to pray to multiple gods or deities and have a big church and do statues. They're much more thoughtful in terms of the land and the earth, believing that everything has a spirit and is connected and should be respected. It's more of a philosophy, a way of thinking than a true religion, and it's very similar to some of the Eastern philosophies that you'll see in some Asian countries. And they believe that the earth should respect it, that the land should be shared in all of its gifts. It's why they had such a difficult time with the Europeans arriving in the 1600s, because they don't really believe in true land ownership. And since they believe that everything should be used, the buffalo, especially for the Plains Indians, since only the Indians who really lived, and like I said, here I go, I just said Indians, not Native Americans. The Indians who really lived in, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and into Kansas might have been really farmers. As you get into the true Great Plains, they're for the most part hunters, and they need the buffalo because the buffalo would provide them with food and with clothing and with medicine of sorts and with tools. And so they're going to use every aspect of that animal, and they're going to use every aspect of the land. And since the Great Plains was not great land for farming because it was so dry and they lacked John Deere tractors and such, they're going to find other ways to survive. And here's a great picture that really kind of shows you yet again, and this is a concept, as I said, that really goes back to your elementary school days. It really goes back to your elementary school days because I feel like you've seen pictures like this before about the importance of the buffalo to the Native American, about how they would use it in terms of food to eat and decorations and basically fly swatters and soaps, and the bones in terms of perhaps games or tools or shovels or dishes or spoons, ladles, things of that nature. So every part of an animal, even the sinew was used to make the thread and the bowstring. So everything was possibly, used that could be. There was no waste here by any means, as it was part of the great respect for the earth. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that, of course, you've got the Plains Indians who are using all aspects of the buffalo. But, of course, if you're talking about a Native American tribe that's living along, the East Coast, that's living in a log cabin, there are no buffalo roaming around. They might hunt deer, but they might not really be hunters. They might be more farmers or fishermen. They might do a lot of trade with other tribes. And of course, they would still have their land that they would protect, that they would live on. They would perhaps get into conflicts with other tribes, and at other times, perhaps they would work together with their tribes, especially as European settlers came. And it was clear that those people had different values and were trying to misuse the land and steal it and control things. But when we talk about, the importance of the buffalo, one shared idea is that all Native American tribes respect the earth, respect Mother Nature, don't really believe in individual land ownership, and believe that animals should be, well respected and used, obviously, for sustenance if you need it, and not just thrown aside the way that perhaps other cultures, the Americans, would. But it's not that all cultures really think the buffalo is that important. Some tribes really need it, others do not. And yet again, it just depends on what food sources they have, because geography really impacts the homes that they live in, the food that they eat, what they trade, how they live their lives. Now, other things to mention about the Great Plains Indians. And so when we're talking about the Great Plains Indians, there's so many different tribes that live in this area. We're going to talk a lot about the Sioux Indians, specifically the Lakota Sioux. But there's many different tribes. So we're speaking in huge generalities here when we're talking about how, for the most part, they're hunters and gatherers and not farmers. That they're sometimes focused on warfare to protect their family life and that they care about the buffalo. For the most part, though, if we're really focusing on just the Plains Indians, they tend to really stay together into small groups, into bands that speak the same language, that work together as a team, that everyone has an assigned role, is respected. And as I said, even though the men tend to be the hunters, women are still important. They're valued. They have specific jobs. Okay, so individualism is important, but for the most part, you're still really going to be focusing on a team, and you're really going to be respecting your elders as another common value that we see between different Native American tribes. Other things about their family life. We said, of course, that they're incredibly religious and they're spiritual. They would defer to their medicine man or their shaman for guidance about what to do in the future, especially if a child was sick or before they would go to war with another tribe, or how to deal with, white settlers as they showed up. And, that was just going to be another aspect of their culture. And as far as, women's rights and equality, that really just depended on the tribe. As far as the Plains Indians, they often got to choose their own husbands, but at times their husbands were chosen for them by their family. They don't have as much rights and respect as, for example, out on the East Coast, the Iroquois tribe. Those women not only chose their husbands, but if they wanted to divorce their husband, the Iroquois women, they simply took his possessions out of a cabin, because it was more of a cabin-style home, like a log cabin, and because there's so many trees out there on the East Coast, and they would just leave his stuff outside the house, and that was it. They were divorced. I mean, that was the whole end of the situation. And the child, or any children that she had had with that man, they weren't even raised very much by the father. They really were raised by her family, and it's a matriarchy, a society where women have all the power. And in fact, instead of even taking her husband's last name, she would have kept hers. So we see it more of a matrilineal kind of society compared to, America as a society where women, if we're talking about traditional marriages, often take a husband's last name. So that was very different. The Plains Indians quite don't have that equality in terms of relationships. The men probably are more dominant compared to the women, but it isn't what we saw in 1800s America either, where women have a lot of rights in this Native American group. In terms of other values that they hold, and remember, as you take your notes, these are your notes, so feel free to write down as much as you want. And once we get through all of section 3 at the end of this week, I will post these notes on Google Classroom, the actual slides for the PowerPoint. But even though they do have kind of a tribal leader, an elder, a chief, he also kind of rules with the help of a council, who are often made up of some of the wisest, strongest men. So it is focused on, their wisdom, their past experiences. It's not just that one person came to power through brute force. And no individual is really allowed to truly dominate. Everyone is allowed to have a voice and to kind of speak their opinion. And, they definitely want to work together for the common good of the whole of the tribe, to ensure that their life and their generation and their views are passed on, from one generation to the next. And I think I already kind of talked about how their view on land ownership and what could be owned and controlled is very different than the view of white settlers, which is why since the 1600s there was such a problem between Native American tribes and whites, because as the first English settlers showed up in 1607 in Jamestown, I'm sure you've seen the Disney version of Pocahontas or other films, those English settlers looked at the land and said, oh, they didn't build anything, so clearly it's unoccupied. Whereas the Native Americans never felt the need to put up, huge buildings. They didn't feel the need to have all this, money thrown about. They didn't see the importance of it or the value of it, because the land itself was the value. It had its pride. They didn't think they needed to have all of these structures. So it's a very different view of how you should respect the earth. Because, of course, as you build more things, you also destroy parts of the earth and create pollution and such. Now, we don't focus a whole lot in this class about the problems, of course, between Pocahontas and first Native American settlers. I should say first white settlers and Native Americans in conflicts because, of course, whites were looking for gold, and then, of course, they're creating colonies, and there's the, American Revolution, and some Native Americans choose to fight on the side of the British, assuming that the British would win and that they would get more rights after the war, and they were really angry at the colonists, not the British. We don't go too much into depth about that now. That's kind of all stuff we learned in the past. So we just refresh some of the main points here. One of those was that Native Americans, of course, used to live all over the United States, but that started to change in 1830. In 1830, Andrew Jackson became president, and I'm sure you've seen Jackson before. He's on your $20 bill. And Andrew Jackson, he went ahead and he was an incredible racist, thought that he was superior and that whites were superior to everyone else, including African Americans and Native Americans. And he passed this law called the Indian Removal Act, where he said that Native Americans had to move west of the Mississippi River. Part of the reason that he wanted Native Americans to move west was because some of the Cherokee Indians who lived in Georgia were living in an area where gold was found. So we've talked about how there's been gold rushes, multiple gold rushes in American history. There's been gold found early on in American history in portions of North and South Carolina. And then in 1829, there was gold found in Georgia. And as you can imagine, whites started flocking to the area wanting to mine for gold, get rich quick. It was the amazing, ticket for a new life. Well, some of the gold was potentially on Native American territory. And that was their land, and of course it would start a huge war. And Jackson could have went in with the army and killed all the Native Americans. He decided that was bad press. He was talked out of that. He tried to swindle the Native Americans into moving and force them to sign a contract. They wouldn't really agree to it, and they eventually took it to the court. And in the Supreme Court case of Worcester versus Georgia, it goes to court, and the Supreme Court of the United States says, look, we're not going to make a move. Until this point, we've basically told the Indians that they are their own separate country. They don't have to pay taxes. They don't have to abide by our laws. They're pretty much their own separate entity from us. So now, if they're their own separate country, how can we possibly tell them to move, basically? And Jackson pretty much says, I don't care. I could care less what happens. And in an unprecedented move, Jackson becomes one of the most powerful presidents of all time, a highly controversial president to this day, because he says, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, I'm going to force them to move anyway. Now, is this an abuse of his power? Yes. The Supreme Court of the United States is the highest court in the land. It's been big talk about the court lately, of course, because it's why the flag's been at half staff, in case you didn't realize that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the first Supreme Court justices in history to really extend many rights to women, passed away last week, so that's why the flag's been at half staff. But the Supreme Court, whatever they say, they're the final ruling in the land. They're the highest court, and yeah, he basically said, I'm not going to listen, and I'm going to force the Indians to move. The Indians were given so much time to move. They still thought the Supreme Court, would tell Jackson that this couldn't happen, that someone would talk him out of it. But it didn't happen. It was a gross abuse of the president's powers. You always want to keep the president in check. That's why we have checks and balances in this country. That's why, the president can veto a law passed by Congress, and then Congress can override the veto. You want to make sure your president doesn't get too powerful so that he doesn't turn into a dictator of sorts. But he was pretty crazy, this one. Highly controversial, and he forces the Indians to move. They end up walking on what becomes known as the Trail of Tears. And literally, they are crying as they're dying. Many Native Americans couldn't walk. They died without food, without supplies, through the snow. And some people have said, well, they should have started leaving earlier. Then they would have been forced to evacuate, basically, when they were. Many of the Indians refused to move, though, because their relatives were buried there, and as part of their religious beliefs, they felt that they needed to be close to their bones and to their bodies. They didn't want to go west. They didn't know what was out there, etc. And so Native Americans get told, you can have the whole West. Move west of the Mississippi River. All of this land is pretty much yours forevermore. No one's ever going to take it from them. Ha! Yeah, right. Because then, of course, after the Civil War, many, many Americans start moving west because of fertile soil, because the Homestead Act offers 160 acres of land for free if you're 21 years of age and you're willing to farm it and improve upon it for 5 years. And so people start moving west in droves. And if you've got all of these people moving out there, 400 to 600,000 families took the government up on this offer. That's a lot of people who are going to be moving into, you guessed it, Native American land. Land that they were promised was going to be theirs forevermore and no one would invade it. And so we're poised for major conflicts here. Not just homesteaders move west. Remember we said that exodusters, African Americans, moved west to try to get a better life, to escape racism. Because remember, this is all happening while Reconstruction of the South is occurring. And people are going to move west more so than ever before because once the Pacific Railway Act is passed and a transcontinental railroad is created, it's easier to move west, and they're even building schools out west under the Morrill Act, and people are getting a better life. I know I went fast these two slides, but we've already talked a lot about this stuff. I don't think you need to write a lot of it down again, but that's up to you as you go through the video to watch and to pause. I was going to bold important stuff again, and I forgot to this time. Sorry about that. I'll try to do it on the next lecture. Now, as more and more people, 400,000, 600,000 people are moving west, you might say, well, what do the Native Americans do? Do they just let them pass through? For the most part, yes. As long as they were not interfering and coming onto their land, looking for gold, trying to build their farm right there, they were okay with it. But if people started to interfere and come onto their grounds, that's when we would see the problems. And for the most part, as we said, cowboys, they were not really worried about attacks from Indians. They were worried about stampedes and such, and bad weather. It's only, going to be conflicts if the Native Americans, for the most part, are provoked. So by 1834, the federal government had made the entire Great Plains one enormous reservation for Native Americans, saying this is your land forevermore. And of course, now that the government has passed the Homestead Act and is encouraging all these people to move west, their land is slowly getting away. And they're trying to force the Native Americans to live in just smaller areas called reservations. And there's going to be specific boundaries for each tribe saying you can only live in this area. Now that was very difficult for the Native Americans to agree to. Yes, in general, the Iroquois, for example, lived in the East Coast, and the Cherokee kind of lived in Georgia, and the Plains Indians, lived throughout Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota. But especially if they're people like the Plains Indians, and they tend to go where the buffalo roam in search of a food source, and they're hunters, gatherers, they're nomads looking for food, water, a better life, it's very difficult to try to nail them in to just a few miles of territory. And so that's really where the problems are going to be created here. They're going to want Native Americans to agree to sign these documents saying this is your land, this is your reservation, and if you leave it, you're going to be faced with a penalty. You can't just attack white settlers. That's going to be the real problem because Native Americans, yet again, they don't really understand this view of land ownership, that one person can own land on this side of the street, but not this side of the street. They say this is Mother Earth, this is one planet. We should be allowed to go freely where we want. And it's going to be that different view of how the land is treated and respected that's where we see the problems. So one of the big treaties, or I should say one of the big conflicts that's going to occur is really going to be the fact that the Sioux, I mentioned the Lakota Sioux Indians, some of the Great Plains Indians, and the Cheyenne Indians, they're going to be told that they can now only hunt in a very small area. And the reason they're told that they can only hunt in a small area is because you've got 400,000, Americans going out there trying to become farmers under the Homestead Act. And you've got all these miners going out there as well as everybody else. And the problem is, if the Native Americans, they see a buffalo, they're going to keep going for it, even if it's technically on, land where there might be gold or land where people are creating their farm. And so we're going to start to see more and more conflicts out west as Native Americans shoot whites, whites shoot Indians, and it goes back and forth. Now, the U.S. government tries to kind of settle the conflict by creating one treaty after another. Um, Originally, they create the first Treaty of Fort Laramie back in 1851, which basically is signed between the U.S., the Sioux, a few other tribes, and it basically said, look, we want you to only stay in a certain area. We're going to keep whites to the trail. We're going to keep you in your area, and then we're going to basically be paying you each year $50,000. And you can use that money to buy guns, to buy food, to buy supplies, because we realize you're not going to be able to hunt for food, so we're going to basically be paying you, in a sense, to stay in the area. Does this work? For a short period of time, basically up until the Civil War, but not forever, because Native Americans don't really, want food and supplies from the U.S. government. They don't want the U.S. government's money. They want to be able to live and practice their life as they always have. Now, one of the other famous kind of conflicts which is going to happen out west is the Sand Creek Massacre, where we've got the Cheyenne Indians, and they're going to be forced into a very dry, desolate portion of Colorado known as the Sand Creek Reserve. You can't really find a whole lot to eat there. There's not a whole lot of buffalo roaming there. It's a difficult life. And this is where they've been told that they have to live. And all around them, you've got white settlers who are looking for gold, silver, setting up farms, having the best land, the best life. And they've been told, no, you get this piece of crap land in the middle. They don't want it. And so they're angry. They decide to, not listen to the treaties that they've been told to follow by the U.S. government. They say, we're our own people. We're going to do what we want. And so they start going to hunt. It leads to more conflicts. Whites shoot them, they shoot whites, and it leads to them attacking a lot of settlements nearby, stealing some of their food and supplies. And so eventually the Colorado governor, John Evans, he orders the militia, basically like the small army group in Colorado, to attack these raiders. And Colonel John Chivington is a bit of a psycho. He hates Native Americans. He kills 500 Cheyenne women, children, men at dawn at Sand Creek while they're first kind of asleep getting out of their beds. We know that 200 of the Cheyenne are killed. I should say just 500 were attacked, but 200 of them are actually killed, mostly women and children. The bodies are mutilated, they're desolated, heads are on spikes. It's terrible. And Chivington, on the other hand, was treated as a hero. He got a statue. That's why some people kind of object to perhaps some statues today. Not quite the same situation, but similar. And so after that Sand Creek Massacre, we're going to start to see more problems than ever before along these trails. And the problems are just going to kind of intensify because more whites are coming in to hunt, to mine, to farm, and Native Americans are very angry because they feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. They're not able to hunt. The buffalo are disappearing. The government's coming through and purposely killing them so that they can build train tracks. And the buffalo are getting scared away by the train, by miners, by farmers. And now the Native Americans are told just to live in these desolate little areas, and it's not working. And specifically, the Sioux Indians are really angry about all the whites coming in along the Bozeman Trail, and how the government's really expanded this area and how it's really kind of, hurting their way of life. Specifically, the Bozeman Trail went through their hunting grounds. And so Chief Red Cloud appealed to the government, trying to say, please, move your trail, don't let people go through here. And as you can imagine, the government's not going to agree, which is going to lead to more conflicts along the Bozeman Trail. And this map here on the side, you can kind of just see in 1492, obviously all of America was controlled by Native Americans, and you can see the slow progression as Native Americans die from diseases brought by European settlers or from conflicts with settlers, and how eventually you can see where they end up living by 1890. Last slide here to talk about is that ultimately the Sioux Indians, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, so all these different Great Plains tribes who do usually war against each other, they decide to actually work together. They work in a guerrilla warfare style atmosphere where they're going to use the environment to their advantage to try to basically attack the surrounding communities, to try to take revenge upon them, because they say if the government is not going to listen and clear people out of the Bozeman Trail, which goes through our hunting grounds and is disrupting our way of life, and we can't feed our families, we're going to clear them out. So the Native Americans start attacking some white settlements. and the whites basically are going to try to respond. But the real big attack is going to happen December 21st, 1866. This is led by Crazy Horse, and they basically lure Captain William Fetterman and his company of soldiers into an ambush at Lodge Trail Ridge. It is a surprise attack of sorts, and they end up killing quite a few of them at the Battle of the 100 Slain, is what the Native Americans called them. The whites call it the Fetterman Massacre, and it's basically in retaliation for the Sand Creek Massacre for the most part. So what you're supposed to be getting out of today's lesson overall is that it's just a continual cycle of violence here going on between Native Americans and whites as the conflict's heating up, as whites move west to try to practice their way of life, forever changing the role of Native Americans. Have a great day, guys.